So now I said I would get a little bit deeper into vectors. So we're seeing here, I gave a numeric example of a vector in my last slide. Now I'm going to give an example with character variables. So this is the most basic element in R. All of other elements are made up of vectors, and that will make a little bit more sense later. But in this case, we had the variable or object name, as I said before. We have our assignment operator, and then we have our vector, which we're seeing here. Remember that the vector always has a C and 2 parentheses around it, and we're looking at Alabama, Texas, Arkansas, and New Jersey. So when you're using multiple values with one dimension, meaning it doesn't have the number of rows or number of columns, you always have to use this C. If you don't, it's going to throw an error and it won't know what to do with it. So keep that in mind. So these are the values in our vector. So I'm going to go in real quick. So we're going to use an example to start. I'm going to use another example. So fruit prices. Say we went to the grocery store and we looked at 6 different types of fruit, and these were the prices. We're going to get to this part in a second, but I do want to show you that fruit prices in this case. So say and we'll learn more about these particular functions later, but they should be pretty self-explanatory. So when I look at the length of fruit prices, it's 6. So when we look up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that makes sense. It's the length of this is 6, but there is also a function for the number of columns. That's just saying what the number of columns in this particular object would be. If I put in fruit prices, it's going to say null because it doesn't have columns because it's only one dimension. Now, if we go up to the state data frame here, so if I put in number of rows, or I'll stick with columns actually, number of columns in state.df, we have 3. So if we open this up, and by doing that, you just click over here, we're seeing that we have 12 we have 3 columns here. Now, if I put the number of rows in state.df, it's going to tell me there are 12. Whereas when I did that or tried to do that with the vector, it didn't know what I was talking about. So that's what I mean by 1 dimension or 2 dimensions. So hopefully that helps clear it up a little bit. We'll learn more about those functions. I believe it's in class 4. I do a tutorial of the real basic helpful functions when you're doing work in R. So that's what I mean by a vector. What I mean that all objects are made up of vectors, I'm going to go in here. So on the back end, I use that word a lot. So that means when they are stored in our data. This is considered a vector. This is another vector. And this is another vector. So that will make a little more sense later because I'm going to show you how to make a data frame with vectors, different vectors. But that's what I mean that all other objects are made up of vectors. So each one of these columns is a separate vector making up a data frame. So that's what I meant by that. So this is a very important concept. Do you guys have any questions about vectors before I move on?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So in the assumptions that I've been making, kind of working with data, skipping ahead maybe a few classes, maybe not.
Yeah.
But I was always assuming that a vector was horizontal the way that it's pictured now. And so when you said a data frame is made up of vectors, I was like, well, that looks like a list because each one of those rows has different data types in it. If you go back to the state data frame, right? It's numeric. Yes. And so how I mean, how is a vector both horizontal and vertical, or at the same time? Does it matter?
Yes, so
Am I
that's
making
actually a really
sense?
good question. Yes, that's a good question, because if that didn't make sense to you, then it probably didn't make sense to other people. It will start to make a little bit more sense later on, but I'll want to go back to try to explain this a little bit better. So a list. So okay, let's go back to this slide.
Let me ask another question, and then it'll maybe be easier for you to explain. When you said that a data frame is made up of vectors, I was assuming that the columns were variables, because that's how we talk about the columns. They're
Yes, they are.
variables, and that the rows would be the vectors. But then I'm like, it looks like those rows are lists to me. So
Yes, so we are actually going to build a data frame from vectors later. So that will make a little more sense, but I do want to go back and explain a little bit more. So when we look at a data frame, this column would actually be one vector. And the reason we would not call this a list is because this is all of one data type. So if you all have been, and if you guys program at all, you'll probably have heard of the transpose function. So R has a transpose function as well. This, and it's not exactly the same, but you can think of it kind of in this way. So we have our states, vector here, and it looks horizontal here, but like I said, it was of one dimension. So it can be made either horizontal or vertical, because it's not assigned. You can give it even as a height or a length. It has none of those characteristics as a vector. So it only has a length. It does not have a height or a width, if you think of it outside of programming. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit because and I have more on this in a better example later, but I think this might be better hard coded. So I am going to go in here. So I have fruit prices here. So we're seeing this, and we're going to go over the cbind function in a minute in more detail, but I think that this will be really helpful for us. So I'm going to make another vector called fruit names. So I'm going to make up names here. Banana. So orange. Strawberries. Raspberries and blueberries. So we will see here that there's 6 values here and 6 values here. So I'm going to create fruit name. So I just ran that code. Now the cbind function we're going to go over later in a lot more detail, but it basically, if you think of cbind, it means the same thing as a column bind. So these right now are vectors, but I can make it a data frame. So all I'm going to do here, and like I said, this will make more sense, and I'll go over the syntax a little bit, but I'm going to make something called fruit.dataFrame. So this, we're going to cbind the or column bind fruit names and fruit prices. So we're going to see this here. We actually have to put something called a data frame. I'll call it this. We have to change it because as a cbind, it automatically changes to a matrix. It forces it, so you have to change it to a data frame.
Yeah, now you've got it up there in the data frames up there.
Yeah. So now we're just going to call it a data frame. So now we'll see these 2 vectors are now vertical, and they have become columns because we, as I said before, we binded the columns. So we binded this as a column and this as a column. So hopefully, and we're going to do a full example using the cbind later, because I thought it would actually be helpful for understanding this. But as just a quick tutorial, that's what I mean where vectors make up a data frame. So does that make sense? A little bit more sense? Did that help? Okay, so hopefully yes.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of does. I'm just thinking about 5 or 6 different concepts down the road, and I don't
Yeah,
want
and
to
then
muddle it. Yeah.
yeah, and then the list, an example of a list is down here. If you will get to that eventually, but we'll run this and see how it looks different, then you're welcome to do that. So I actually go over a list example later on. So, okay. So I'll keep going, and in this, I think it'll help because I'm building on all of this as I go. That's why I changed the order of this class very substantially from the last time I taught it, because I'm trying to do it in an order where things build on other things. So hopefully that helps.